Okay, good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the final panel discussion of CRISPRCon 2020 virtual. I'm Julie Shapiro with the Keystone Policy Center. We're a third-party, nonprofit, non-advocacy organization bringing together diverse perspectives on societal challenges. Keystone Policy Center is based in Keystone, Colorado, on the lands of the Ute people. We're proud to facilitate CRISPRCon's conversations on science, society, and the future of gene editing. CRISPRCon aims to highlight many perspectives and experiences, spark curiosity, build understanding, and share societal histories and contexts relevant to decisions on gene editing technologies and applications of health, conservation, and agriculture. 2020 is CRISPRCon's fourth year, and this will mark our 10th and final webinar over the past 2 months. Throughout the entire series, we've had a broad-ranging lineup of speakers, including life scientists and social scientists, journalists, business leaders, farmers, conservationists, consumer advocates, patient advocates, social justice advocates, global economic development leaders, religious leaders, funders, and philanthropists, and more. If you missed any of our earlier virtual sessions, we encourage you to check them out on our CRISPRCon YouTube channel, which includes free access to our discussions dating back to 2017. So far this year, we've discussed gene editing in the context of race and health disparities, indigenous perspectives, storytelling and journalism, gene editing research in China, framing and governance of risks and benefits in gene editing in agriculture and food, considerations for climate, conservation and justice, and public health and health autonomy. We want to thank our sponsors for supporting the mission of CRISPRCon and our ability to create these important conversations. Our programmatic sponsors are Corteva and United Soybean Board. You can visit the virtual expo to link to relevant past CRISPRCon content and to learn more about this week's partners and sponsors. Let me now further introduce today's session theme. This week, CRISPRCon is exploring themes of priority and agenda setting. Earlier this week, we explored complexities and trade-offs of gene editing-focused health approaches for treatment versus prevention, as well as the scale and significance of impact for individuals versus society at large. Today, we'll explore the role of funders and philanthropists in setting the gene editing agenda. Investment in gene editing technologies plays a significant role in the technology's evolution and its applications to issues in health, agriculture, conservation, and more. This panel will explore current funding pathways and priorities for applications of gene editing, as well as for applications of gene editing in the context more generally of investment in global development, health, and ag. Who's making the investments and what are the values being used to evaluate their application and impact? How are societal risks, benefits, and perspectives incorporated into the investment decisions that are shaping the future of gene editing? We hope that the dialogue will bring out lots of lively discussion among panelists and participants. Please use the stage chat to submit questions for the panelists at any time during the panel. Divergence and disagreement, as always, are welcome. Please be empathetic, curious, engaged, and respectful as you listen and share across various perspectives. Also, just a quick note that after our panel session, we'll transition into Ideas Marketplace small group discussion sessions. Please plan to stick around for those if you can. I'll share more information in my closing remarks. At this time, I'd like to invite our moderator and panelists to join me on stage. I'll ask each of them to share their audio and video as I begin to introduce them, and we'll hear more from each of them on their background as they join us. More detailed bios are also available at our CRISPRCon.org website. So first, we've got our moderator, David Winnicott, head of Working Party on Bio, Nano, and Converging Technology at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We've got Brentley Brown, Senior Program Officer at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome, Brentley. We have Ann Geaver, Program Manager for the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, Biological Technologies Office. Welcome, Ann. We have Jeremy Diago, Head of Regional Office of the African Union Development Agency, New Partnership of Africa's Development, African Biosafety Network of Expertise. And then finally, we have Shahram Sayedin Noor, Founder and General Partner of Civilization Ventures. I'll remove myself from the stage now so that Shahram can join us, and I'll turn things over to David to moderate our discussion on the role of funders and philanthropists in setting the gene editing agenda.
Thanks, Julie, very much. We'll wait for Shahram's image to pop in, and there he is. It's really a delight to share the stage with this great group of actors in the sphere of investment in one way or the other. Funders and investors have a really big influence on where technologies go. This is just a fact. One can regulate all you want and exert governance in various kinds of ways. But if you have a big push through funding for research and development to diffusion, that's just going to have a big impact on where technologies go and where gene editing will go. This is a fantastic group and panel, and we'll hear from different sectors and perspectives, different regions, to reflect on the issue of the role of investors and investment, and the processes that go into making philanthropic and other kinds of investments in gene editing. I want to start with this group to let the audience get to know you a little bit and your organization. If I could ask each of you to just talk briefly about yourself and your work to ground the discussion, and then we can move into a more substantive question. But Brentley, can I invite you to introduce yourself?
Everybody, my name is Brentley Browning, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here with you, to be able to join this conversation, and just to give you a little bit of a bit of insight in terms of the work that I'm engaged on and the team that I work with. I focus on agricultural development, and the area within that in particular is around policy and advocacy. But let me provide a little bit of context in terms of the work that we do. We're focused on agricultural transformation, power of agricultural development, agricultural transformation to lift as many people out of poverty in the developing world as possible. If you look back and you think about all of the countries in their development journey, those who have, almost no country has lifted itself out of poverty without doing so through its agricultural sector, particularly when you've got 70 to 80% of your population engaged in agriculture. So one of the things that we prioritize and that we're looking at is partnering with governments, partnering with the international community to think about that journey, think about that pathway to agricultural transformation, so that agricultural growth is as equitable and is as inclusive as possible. Particularly as you begin to think about growth in the agricultural and rural sectors and eventually a more diversified economy. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on there. We focus not only in terms of upstream research, global public goods, but also in terms of direct development partnership with governments and with other actors on the ground to be able to address some of the constraints that are preventing agricultural transformation from happening, and to work with governments in terms of their plans and their priorities to be able to create the opportunities necessary for poverty reduction and economic growth. Thank you.
Thanks, Brentley, very much. Anne Geaver, can I ask you to introduce yourself and your work?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for letting me be here to discuss this issue. It's a very interesting and important one. Program manager at the Biological Technologies Office at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, as it's commonly known. I manage a portfolio of projects, including the Safe Genes program, which is developing gene editing tools with safety built in at the inception. So this program addresses the need for innovation in the areas of biosecurity and biosafety by developing those strategies to control, counter, reverse the effects of gene editing. And so DARPA funds these kinds of cross-cutting technology development projects, really with the goal of de-risking that next generation and pushing forward the state-of-the-art concepts for cost-effective solutions for problems that affect the warfighter.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Jeremy, could I have you introduce yourself and your work?
Thank you, David. I'm really happy to be part of this discussion. I'm Jeremy Ouedraogo. I work for the African Union Development Agency. I'm based in Dakar, Senegal, where I lead the regional office for West Africa. I also lead the African Union program in charge of, let's say, supporting the African countries to build and establish functional biosafety regulatory systems. This is in line with the aspiration number 1 of the African Union Agenda 2063, dealing with agriculture transformation and modernization, and also really dealing with any socio-economic sector that definitely need to harness emerging technologies to push that agenda. And African Union, together with the United Nations, as you all know, African Union did decide to make sure that by 2030, disease like malaria is eradicated in the continent. And also, we plan in this continent to end hunger by 2030. So any technology that can contribute to that has been made a priority in this continent through different pathways. That's why I'm really interested in being part of this. As you all also know, AUD and NEPAD has been recently established to implement all the priority programs for this continent. And it's also meant to provide any advisory support when it comes to regarding relevant technologies for the continent. And you should, from this presentation, understand why I'm happy to be part of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And last but not least, Sharon, please introduce yourself and your work.
Thank you very much, David. I'm Sharon Lee, founder and general partner at Civilization Ventures. First, thank you to Julie and the organizers of CRISPRCon for inviting me. My background is in the world of entrepreneurship. I've been an entrepreneur in the life sciences space going on 10 plus years. I started Civilization Ventures 3 years ago with a mission to make impact investments in healthcare and biology across really 3 sectors. Synthetic biology, which obviously includes tools like CRISPR, gene editing, digital health, and genomics and diagnostics. And I'm especially excited to be on this panel because we look regularly at investments in companies that are using CRISPR tools or kind of next generation CRISPR-based tools to solve and cure both rare diseases and more common diseases. And we do come across a lot of issues around equity and IP and other themes that are relevant to the discussion today. So it's great to be with you all, and I look forward to contributing to the discussion.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, I think the audience would agree that we have a very well-selected group of panelists. So well done, Julie and Biana and company. We have someone from a small philanthropic organization like the Gates Foundation. That's a joke. A mega player in the philanthropic stage. We have a leader in the African Union development apparatus, a high-level manager in DARPA, and a successful venture capitalist, all working and thinking around gene editing and related issues. So I think we have the plates are set. So I think it's time to ask a question. I want to direct it first to Brentley, and the question really is about trying to put the investments of the Gates Foundation in gene editing and maybe genetically modified organisms generally within the context of the larger priorities that you wish to achieve. Now, you've talked about agricultural transformation. That was a very clear goal. Where does gene editing fit into that goal exactly? And how does it relate to trying to address some very systemic problems around sustainability and poverty alleviation?
Thanks, David. Really appreciate that introduction and the question itself. It's incredibly important. And I think maybe the best way to tackle this is to put this into the context of the Foundation's views in terms of the bigger picture that we're trying to tackle, and then back to editing. So in terms of some of the systemic opportunities and the ways that we are thinking about this in transformation and agricultural development, I think we need to be thinking about how all of this ladders up to transformational goals that can guide collective action. And one of the best examples that we have is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Jeremy just mentioned ending hunger by 2030 is one of those goals. And yet, unfortunately, we are off track. Just in the past year, due to COVID, the FAO recently put forward its estimates in terms of the number of people living in food insecurity, number of people living with food insecurity. Due to COVID, we're looking at an additional 80 to 130 million people who have become hungry over the past year. And you know, with these types of challenges, when we're thinking about things like ending poverty, tackling climate change, you know, reducing hunger, there's some big questions that we as donors and developing country governments, everybody who cares about this, there's big questions in terms of the resources that we have available and how to deploy them. What would it take? What are the priorities? How much would it cost? What do we know collectively in terms of being able to prioritize and accelerate progress towards these goals? It's exciting because just recently we had a global consortium of researchers called CERES 2030. And what they were setting out to do was to really look at this question: how much would it cost, and where do we know, what do we know is most effective, so that we can help to guide these collective efforts. And what they did was they took over 100,000 peer-reviewed articles and really looked at the evidence base. What is it? What do we know? Where are we strong? Where are the gaps? What lessons can we infer from that? And they applied an economic model to be able to help guide us in our thinking and develop these recommendations. They came up with 3 major buckets. Now there's upwards of 14 specific policy interventions that come forward, but if we just stick to the higher level, the first is to empower the excluded. The second is on-farm investment, and the third is food on the move. Now, as the donor community, they estimate in terms of the cost that we would need to double the current donor investment spend per annum to $14 billion per year. And if we do so, we have the opportunity to be able to lift 490 million people out of hunger, and to double the incomes of small-scale farmers of 545 million small-scale farmers and their families. That is huge. And that is the kind of thinking that we need to be having, which is spanning the full breadth and depth of the ag sector and the full range of tools and approaches that are available to us, and to look at what's most effective and to really drive action, concerted action there. Now, the role of gene editing. If you look within on-farm investments and what the researchers are telling us, one of the key areas is, for instance, climate resilient crops. Gene editing has a potential and powerful role to play in that, but it's also critically important that on-farm investments such as extension are prioritized, and the bigger system in terms of just being able to not only have access to improved seeds, for instance, but access to extension services, agronomic practices, access to functioning markets, post-harvest handling. It is a big picture. And so gene editing is absolutely one of those things that has enormous potential. We're excited about that potential, but it's one tool of many, and we need to be putting it in that context, that we need to be working across systems, and we need to be thinking about that bigger picture and the dependencies that come along within complex systems such as agriculture.
Thanks, Brentley. So it sounds like gene editing is perceived to be a tool, a possible piece of a much larger picture in terms of how the Gates Foundation is approaching this this problem of agricultural transformation. I want to turn to Jeremy on that question too. Jeremy, your bread and butter work is on setting development goals in Africa and trying to achieve them. You're in the world of biosafety. What's your view on how your organization will or will not approach, what role might biotechnology play and gene editing technology in this vision for Africa 2063 that you mentioned?
Thank you, David. Starting from 2007, the African Union has made it very clear through a principle, the freedom to innovate. The African Union head of state made a decision to all the member states requesting them to harness modern biotechnology in agriculture transformation and also in other, let's say, socioeconomic development areas like health and industry. This is to make sure that any single relevant technology is explored to contribute to that. When you consider, let's say, biotechnology or genome editing, they come in as supplementary tools to explore. That's why the decision was also made while scientists in the continent are pushing for the technology in their laboratories. At the same time, the safety issues should be handled together with the technology development. Genome editing and other relevant technologies, as I said, are coming in to complement the failures. Conventional breeding has done a lot in the continent, but we do have areas where we need to up the game and consider different approaches where the conventional processes have failed. That's why the African Union considered that emerging technologies coming in should be harnessed by the local scientists. And we are very happy to see that there is a shift of paradigm in the African countries today. COVID-19 has been a hard time for the continent, but at the same time, the continent did realize that scientific development should be the solution to most of our challenges. And genome editing today in many countries come in for crop. It's also coming in. We talk about health. So I really think that what we need to consider today are mostly areas of accessibility of the technology, availability of data, and make sure that we will not be, let's say, using those new technologies like genome editing to serve those who really have the power in terms of rich countries. I definitely think that in Africa it will not work because the public sector responsibility is engaged and the local government are really pushing for scientists to definitely be part of the development of this technology. But they should keep in mind that in most of the African countries, you don't have health insurance for everyone. How do we make sure that this technology will not just serve those who have money to buy for it? That's some of the issues surrounding the development of this technology. Otherwise, I would say agriculture, health are the key areas where genome editing for now should definitely have the investment of the public sector in the continent and also the investment contribution from the development partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that answer. And it's interesting that in a sense, these public agencies are investing in the technology, or they're providing support for the uptake of the technology to achieve their goals. But as you point out, for you, the key points are about availability of technology, availability of data, accessibility of technology, and the use and power that goes along with these tools. And speaking of public agencies, I want to turn to DARPA and Geaver, where in the United States, we've heard how there's a biological technology office in this agency, DARPA in the United States government. And within the universe of DARPA's investments, where does gene editing sit in the landscape and within the landscape of the missions and visions of the agency?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. No. Thanks, David. Sorry, David. So gene editing is just one technology that DARPA has made significant investments in across multiple programs. So really, the advent of gene editing technologies, or faster, better, cheaper DNA synthesis, DNA sequencing, has really dramatically decreased the cost and time of generating transgenic organisms from multiple applications. And so the program that I manage, Safe Genes, is one of those programs. I would say that two main areas that are really benefiting from the development of Safe Genes tools, which are really those tools to control, counter, or reverse the effects of gene editing, are in the areas of therapeutics. So being able to prevent unwanted genome modification will allow for more targeted therapies and more precise use of these kinds of tools for that kind of sector. And the other is vector control. So thinking about ways to prevent mosquito vector species from becoming infected with a virus in the first place, but also modulating that vector species to prevent infection at the source will then disallow those mosquitoes to pass the virus on to an animal or a human. And so gene editing technologies really, I think, they're part of the solution space for these kinds of difficult public health challenges, for example, but really understanding how these investments fit together, I think there's some more modeling, some more analysis that would be needed to identify the kind of optimal mix. There are other gene editing programs at DARPA. I won't really comment specifically on other programs that some of my colleagues manage, but one example is DIGIT. So being able to detect it with gene editing technologies is what it stands for. And this is really an area where you can incorporate a gene editor for detectors for health biosurveillance or point-of-view diagnostics for emerging pathogenic threats. And so, from the beginning, Safe Genes has looked at ways to consider biosafety and biosecurity, biocontainment as part of best practices and lessons learned. So we do look at ways to make sure that these experiments are conducted in a way that in the laboratory that have physical and ecological barriers, so there's no open release under the program. So we are involved in those kinds of discussions on ongoing biosecurity concerns around this technology. But in addition to the technological side of development and those tools that have been formed with safety by design in mind, Safe Genes has also incorporated ELSI, so the Ethical, Legal, Societal Implications panel, along with community engagement as a really integral part of the program. And so individual projects and performers all have strategies to address these kinds of issues, as well as an external panel of advisors that provide feedback to our researchers and our staff. So those are really going back to gene editing as just one intervention, I think, as part of a holistic
I'm going to stay with you, Anne, for 1 second, then go to Sharon directly, because we haven't heard from him, and I have a question for him. But following up on the specific role of an agency like DARPA in developing an emerging technology, I think that for some, there might be a perception that, I guess, of some concern that it would be an agency that is affiliated with the military and military spending and developing technologies for humanity, but with defense application. There might be some concerns that this maybe not the ideal place to advance our technologies for the good of humanity as a whole. And I wonder what you might say to that critic who would be concerned about that.
Yeah, so I think really it's going back to the mission of DARPA. So DARPA is really grounded in the mission, which is really to focus on the warfighter and keeping them safe. And so they can be affected by mosquito-borne diseases, which also have global impacts. And so when it comes to a program like SafeGene specifically, again, our emphasis is really on safety by design. And so if those control and safety mechanisms are in place, advancements in this area can spur innovation, it can shorten those technology development timelines, and I think really also sort of democratize that novel technology. You're lowering the cost of development for the private sector in a lot of ways. And so the way we think of it is that you can go faster in a car with really good brakes. So if you trust those brakes to stop an accident from happening, whether that's accidental or misuse in this case, then technology developers can really push the limits of science because you can trust then that those safety measures are in place to protect them. And so SafeGenes has set out to lay that groundwork for really safe and predictable applications of technologies like gene editing. And then once again, going back to the goal, it's really to preserve the health of service members, as well as support public health more broadly.
So I think that's an interesting set of reasons, and you've articulated, I think, well the reasons why why there might be overlap with public interest in the kinds of things that you're doing. I think that to me it does raise this question of ultimately the source of funding and whether there's some kind of accountability and how we choose how to use our funding for the development of new technologies. And so I want to turn to Sharon for this question, which is, I think some critics, we've heard a little bit of echo of this from Jeremy, but in a slightly different direction. But there's some concerns about the power dynamics associated with a relatively small group of funders or of investors in a technology seem to have a lot of significant influence over where technologies go and the kinds of pathways that they take. And I just wonder about you personally and your organization. Are you worried at all about accountability to the kinds of publics that will be affected by your investments or the investments from the private sector? Is there a kind of a stance or an understanding of a potential accountability gap or democracy deficit that might exist as you bring forward and push through these exciting new technologies?
Thank you, David. You saved the controversial stuff for me, which I like. I'm going to unpack that question into a few different questions. So there's the concept of an investor like us. By the way, I don't think we as a fund, Civilization Ventures, has much kind of monopoly power in any sense, because we're only a $50 million fund. But as an aggregate group, venture capitalists obviously control tens of billions, hundreds of billions. And that does dictate where scientists and researchers and certainly commercial enterprises spend their time. They want to get venture funding. You need to get venture funding after you have initial NIH funding to get a project to completion, certainly to get almost all drugs to the market. And I think most of my peers, certainly we are cognizant of the role we play in society. And by definition, our investments are impact investments because we're investing in healthcare and biology tools to further human existence and health. Having said that, there's a real market failure, which I think we're all cognizant of. And that market failure is that if something doesn't appear on its face profitable, if the market size may be too small, or if the profits aren't within the 10-year horizon of venture returns or even commercial endeavors, then it's not going to get the kind of funding that it may deserve. That's obviously why we have the NIH and other sources of funding. But even that may not be good enough. And therefore, it's really important to, as a society, be able to analyze different products that we're after, different goods that we believe society needs, whether it's for agricultural purposes as discussed by Brentley, or equitable distribution in continents like Africa as discussed by Jeremy, or for defense purposes as discussed by Anne. I mean, we're seeing the results of poorly coordinated private response to COVID-19. It's obviously a national defense issue, and I believe our president didn't treat it as such, and that's unfortunate. And I think as a result, the way I see it is that we need to identify the exact types of products and areas where we need public funding, where we know there will be a market failure if left to private companies, private funders like our fund and others. One obvious area is, for example, antibiotic resistance. We just don't see enough development in that area because it's become the graveyard of venture investments. People don't go near tools that can help overcome antibiotic resistance, even though we know it's a predictable problem, it's a current problem, and it's likely to get a lot worse. And that's an obvious area where venture capitalists won't be able to solve it because there doesn't seem to be the kind of pull from the market side. It's one of those things where you need to plan ahead, plan for what could be a worst case scenario, like COVID-19 ended up being. And the same goes for many applications of CRISPR. For example, we're looking at companies now that are looking to cure diseases like HIV using CRISPR. Raises a few questions. What is the size of that market in the US? It's actually a big market, but what will be the application of that technology to continents like Africa and others where maybe they don't want to pay $500,000 per treatment, per curative treatment? And those are complicated questions. It's definitely not the ambit of venture capitalists to figure out the answers. That's why we have governments. But I think responsible VCs will tell you that, at least I hope that responsible VCs will recognize their own shortcomings and also not try to monopolize the discourse and say we're the solution to all innovation. I just don't think that's the case. That's why we have the Gates Foundation and DARPA and other players.
Thank you, Sharon.
I don't know if that answers it.
Yeah, I think it was a really good set of steps to trying to get at this nut, which is, I think you hit on important substantive aspects in the sense that there are problems that just aren't being addressed, and there are problems that public players or philanthropic players will have to address that private capital just won't be able to address. I think the other concern that people have, though, is not just substantive but procedural as well. Meaning, what is the process through which decisions are made about new technologies that will have a big impact on people? So we know gene editing is predicted to have a pretty big impact on people through a variety of potential applications in health, agriculture, gene drives, maybe we'll see. Should not that public should be in the boardroom, in contributing necessarily directly to the, what mechanisms could there be to make the decision making more accountable, let's say, to the people who will be affected by investing decisions that are made? And let me turn it to Brentley, maybe, and take Sharon off the hot seat, at least for this. Brentley, what about that question about perception that people like Gates, groups like Gates, are just too powerfully shaping the trajectory of a technology, and it's leaving people who are affected no voice in the matter?
Yeah, thanks, David. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So I think this question around process, the procedural aspects, and how to engage, responsibly in these matters, it's critically important. Let me jump back to something because I wanted to pick up on something that Jeremy said a little bit earlier, particularly as it relates to accessibility to technology and accessibility to data. Transparency is critically important. And something that we take quite seriously. First off, the investments that we make, we have a publicly accessible database. We have a policy that's called global access, and that's very much to the points that Jeremy is making, very valid points. If we're making investments as a charitable organization, if we're making investments, we need to ensure that the tools, the services, the goods actually reach their intended beneficiaries. And there's two requirements as it relates to global access. One is related to the access to the information and knowledge gained, the research that is happening, the data sets that underpin it, that those are publicly available, that they're widely accessible, and that they're disseminated. The second aspect relates to the actual products, the tools, the products, the innovations, and whether or not they are widely affordable, available, and accessible. So for intended beneficiaries, is it even feasible for them to be able to access the technology, for instance, or the product, whatever it may be, that we have helped to support in terms of the creation? So we take that quite seriously, and yet the bigger question for us extends even beyond us. So we make investments in global public goods that are widely available, publicly available when they reach, and it's up to countries, companies, and others to be able to decide whether or not they want to be able to leverage those and to be able to apply them. So in the case of agriculture, if you're making investments through a gene-edited, improvement in terms of a particular crop or trait, or others, the investment that we make is helping to bring that global public good to fruition. And then it's a sovereign decision as it relates to these new technologies as to whether or not the technology should be leveraged if the appropriate biosafety frameworks and testing mechanisms and ability to be able to really review and understand the efficacy and also the safety of the product, which is critically important. And that's a sovereign decision that needs to be informed by the public with adequate consultation, with the participation of all stakeholders. And that's something that is critically important. I know Jeremy can speak very, very strongly about this in terms of the experience in places like Sub-Saharan Africa. That's an obligation that we take quite seriously, and it's also about meeting demand and being demand-led in terms of where ultimately the demand for these products are coming from. It's so important to have the feedback from developing countries as to whether or not they want the technology, whether or not they have the resources to be able to take that technology to deploy it, to safely manage it. But those are processes that need to happen in country, and we are very much committed to supporting those processes, to being part of the dialogue, and ultimately it's a sovereign decision around the decision whether or not to expand the number of choices available to small-scale farmers around some of the inputs that they could access, and that's something that we actively engage in and are. Look forward to the conversation.
So thanks, Brentley, and thanks for connecting it back to Jeremy. I want to ask Jeremy something that came in from one of the viewers related to these, I guess, the decisional power over what to invest in. There's a concern from this viewer that that certain jurisdictions can actually limit the ability of countries to invest or philanthropic groups to make a difference in GMOs, referring to concerns about how Europe might be limiting the market and therefore reducing even the ability to make philanthropic or local investments in those areas. And I wondered, you answered. We've talked a little bit before, but do you want to just respond to that specific question, because I think it's a really good one in the context of investment.
Thank you, David. Definitely, today Africa, as I said, the paradigm has been shifted. when it comes to those new technologies, Africa do consider Europe as a market really to take. As we all know, Europe import a lot of GM, let's say, grains from America, from Argentina for feed. And Africa do consider selling soya and maize for that to Europe. There we have.
Jeremy, we're having a little trouble hearing you. Maybe I could ask you to turn off your screen. It might increase the available bandwidth. Maybe we'll try that.
Yes.
Or it sounds like it's okay now if you want to try again.
Okay, let me try. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was simply stressing the fact that currently Africa do consider Europe as a market for GM crops, as Europe do import a lot of grains from America and Argentina. So, you know, the decision-making process for this is really up to each country. We have regulatory framework established in each single country of the continent. We do have a small number yet to do that, but the countries do have researchers involved in, they have put in place regulatory agencies to do the approvals before any single trial can be implemented in the continent. When it comes to the position of Europe, the position in Africa today is that let's definitely develop our own way of doing things. Partnership is good. We will learn from America, we will learn from Europe, but definitely let's put our finger on any relevant technology for the continent. That's why today, as I replied online, the continent has established even what we call the African Union High-Level Panel on Emerging Technologies. This is made up with highly qualified scientists to advise the head of states on the relevant technologies to be harnessed by the continent. And I can tell you the very last one that has been approved is gene drive to control malaria. And currently we expect them to, let's say, make a statement regarding genome editing. So for the continent today, I would say Europe is a good case in terms of learning and considering the concerns they used to raise and make sure that we address them in the continent regarding the same technologies. But it doesn't prevent the continent definitely to make its own decision. At the African Union level, you know, usually the big entities move slowly. That's why today you have individual countries who already approved genome editing, let's say, trials, just to make sure that their own scientists do own the technology. This is critical for public acceptance, and also it's critical for more democracy in handling this technology. I'm talking about democracy in terms of making sure that the largest number of population will access the gene editing products. This is critical. And one key criteria for that is really the public sector engagement and also the local scientists owning the technology, being part of the development process. That's absolutely critical. When it comes to some power dynamics, you know, you cannot prevent that. You know, when someone is putting money, he just want to make sure that his own areas of interest are captured. But I can tell you, African Union, through its agency, for the Development has made things very clear. We do partner with those who really want to partner with the continent. But the continent has its own, I would say, continental policy. This is Agenda 2063 with clear aspirations, and it's implemented at the national level with very clear policies, so that any single technology to come in a country should be approved by the National Biosafety Authority and the highest level, the ministers, to make sure that this is in line with the national policy. And the end product should also meet the requirement of democracy in terms of sharing the benefit from that technology. This should be definitely kept in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Interesting that the word democracy came up. I think we'll maybe come back around to what that can mean in the context of investment. Yeah. But I'd like to pose a question that is also coming from the chat. And I'd like to pose it to Sharon. And it's a very short question, but not an easy one. Is genome editing in agriculture part of what you describe as market failure?
I don't necessarily think so, because there's plenty of economic incentive for gene editing to be applied to agriculture in the United States. If the question is, should those advancements and intellectual property derivative of investments in agriculture for gene editing in the United States be exported in a way that's equitable, that's a separate question. But there's no market failure in the US because agriculture is a massive, massive market. There is inequitable wide when it comes to any innovation in the US or elsewhere in wealthier countries, and that's not limited to agriculture. I did want to touch upon one thing, David, and that has to do with your point about process and how process is a part of the equitable distribution or application of these technologies. And the reality is, there is, I believe, a bit of a shortcoming in that respect in the US. For example, there's at least half, maybe more, of fundamental innovation in the US is funded by the government, whether it's NIH or NSF or other agencies, DOD. They fund a lot of the innovation. And that, there's a social bargain which says we as citizens pay our taxes, we support representatives who vote in these budgets so that they can fund innovation in universities and elsewhere, and that results in novel intellectual property and products which benefit all of us, and it results in commercial enterprises which create jobs. That's the social bargain. Where it fails is that it should also result in some type of price equity. You can't have the government funding IP that spins out of, let's say, Berkeley, and then there's a commercial funding on top of it from firms like mine, and then they charge whatever they want. I think that's one of the reasons why healthcare is a failed system in the United States. It doesn't make sense. Either not have any government funding, in which case there's no argument against maybe innovation being privately funded and charging whatever it wants. But if you have a system like the one that we do, where basically most of these innovations would not exist but for taxpayer money, there has to be some equity on the flip side. And that has to do with process too, David. I think your word process is important here, because right now that process basically is the NIH, funds the university's tech transfer office takes a nice pound of flesh when it comes to, us negotiating technology out, but the taxpayer only gets something out of it when it goes commercial, results in sales, and assuming that the pharma company isn't dodging taxes, which they normally are. So there's a failure there. And I think there's a failure in pricing these drugs, which needs to be much more equitable while permitting margins and profitability for the industry, because you don't want to kill the golden goose, which is free enterprise. But there needs to be some voice by the citizenry and taxpayers and all the research that they put money into. So that's probably a point of view you won't hear from most VCs and from most people in the startup community. And I think it's because they lack maybe a fundamental understanding of, who's lining their pockets. Without the government, pretty much the industry would be gone.
So it's interesting. I think that part of what you're saying is that we as taxpayers are investors, and that we're investing into science, in these various ways. And in that sense, we're part of a contract. There's kind of an understood contract of benefits flowing back. And there may be real bones to pick about what the actual payouts of the contract are and whether they're fair.
Exactly. I mean, David, just to be very crystal clear about it, if you're working a 9-to-5 job, paying your taxes, and you're okay with government funding of innovation so that drugs can come out, it's so that it can benefit you. But if that drug ends up being $1 million and you can't afford it because you're uninsured or even your insurance won't cover it, then there is no benefit to that person. And that's true of a lot of drugs for a lot of the population. So it's just a fundamentally broken system in that respect that needs to be remedied, I think.
As you are located in California, I want to just ask you if you, as far as I remember, being a former resident of California, the California Stem Cell Initiative, which was a $3 billion state-funded initiative for stem cell research, actually put provisions in for some kind of cost provision, reasonable costs of products developed as a result of the funding. And it's interesting because it's a way in which the investor made some more clear demands about what should come out on the other side. And so I wonder if maybe there are different ways to experiment with how to do this investment of the public into the enormous amount of science and technology that's being funded by the taxpayer.
Good question. I wish I were more familiar with the exact provisions of the stem cell initiative that you described. There was actually another ballot measure in this election dealing with something similar. My understanding is that it was more the state stepping in to fill a void left by the federal government around some issues on stem cell research a decade or two ago. I didn't realize there were provisions attendant to how that money is spent or the fruits of that research. If there are, that would be interesting. I'm not sure how they would enforce it nationally, but it sounds interesting. This stuff fundamentally, in my view, must be nationally coordinated. You can't have a state-by-state approach to fundamental issues around pricing and intellectual property and equitable distribution. But I'd be interested to learn more about that.
So let's ask another question and drill into the maybe question of justice, democracy, regarding the issue of diversity and inclusion, those kinds of issues in your work. I wonder, Anne, if you might speak to the ways in which issues of diversity, equity, inclusion are a part of what you do, a part of the kinds of consideration of the oversight groups that you mentioned, and just for the taxpayers' investment in having great science help the military, our military officers, and help see the economy. Is diversity and inclusion, are these words that are spoken, that are talked about, that are meaningful in that context?
Yep. Thanks, David. Yeah. So DARPA, as I mentioned, is not a philanthropic organization, but we use a broad agency announcement approach. So this goes out to the public, and then we really sort of choose proposals based on technical merit. So like we really start and end with sort of the technical merit of the research and the proposals that we fund. So we're a little different than other military contracts too. We don't really work under a common work statement. So DARPA seeks to solve really unique and complex problems. In some cases, we're almost asking performers or researchers to do the impossible. And so then we go on, we have independent groups of reviewers who look at these proposals, and then those kinds of findings and results are source selection sensitive. But DARPA does a lot of outreach. We hold regular meetings with vice presidents of research at diverse universities. We do conduct outreach to minority institutions, make sure that they're aware of research opportunities and for inclusion there. DARPA does a lot of small business programs for support to small business innovation. We have a Young Faculty Award, and so these they have to be an early career scientist at a university or other institution like that, where the review stage is blind. It's based purely on technical merit. But really those investment decisions are part of the process, but DARPA program managers are really hired based on ideas and that alignment with DARPA and the DoD. And so they come in with concepts, and they're term limited, so we last about 4 years, and so there's a lot of turnover at the agency, and that allows new ideas, innovation, new perspectives to solve new problems. And so when you think about how these investments will serve a population or the broader population, I think ultimately the goal here is to transition the technology so it can become more widely available. So in a lot of ways, we're making an investment to de-risk the technology and bring down the cost. And so, we're funding cutting-edge research. We have these goals to bring that particular technology off of the lab bench and to the market, kind of an off-the-shelf availability. And so it depends on the program what these goals are, but generally it's really to move advancements faster, to be more economical. We don't have labs, we don't make products, but we fund that technology so that companies can pick them up and then provide a product or a service back to the DoD and the public in as economically valuable way as possible. And so I think in that way, DARPA does play a role to sort of democratize and expand the gamut of technologies to bring down the cost and include the technical proposals possible there.
Thanks, Anne. And I have a follow-up from the audience, and that is, what about the process for societal and social consideration around gene drives? What unique responsibilities and accountabilities should attach for funders of these more controversial research applications?
Yeah, so gene editing and gene drives are a unique case. So we do make sure as part of the Safe Genes program that we're incorporating an ELSI panel, as I mentioned, along with community engagement. And so this work has been really important. An example here is that some of our teams are engaging with the communities. They've published proceedings, reports, and lessons learned from those engagements with their communities and different stakeholders. A specific example is we have a California team led by University of California, Riverside. And so they have focus groups where they actually talk to residents of California on particular areas that may be impacted by invasive mosquitoes. And they collect feedback and responses on the technologies that are being developed for controllable gene drive. So looking at a gene drive approach for vector control. And so as part of the Safe Genes program, we fund these groups, we fund specific social scientists to develop a framework that can really provide guidance on how engagements results should be or could be used by researchers. So really feeding in those kinds of results and engagement back into the technological advancement and development is an important part of the Safe Genes program. And so that, along with incorporating the ELSI panel and experts in these areas, really provide those kinds of ideas and suggestions for ongoing activities to keep that chain of communication.
So just one final follow-up. So you see that as a kind of unique responsibility of a funder in this case towards a particular technology if it raises those issues?
Yes, I do think that funders are in a unique position to kind of promote that kind of engagement with social scientists in combination with some of the other sciences. And I think that that's someplace that it's difficult to make those connections in a lot of ways, and I think that funders can have an important role to play there.
Yeah, the power of the funder is, I think, as you've said, that's interesting and important. Let me read another question which came through. It might fall to Brentley, but we'll see. The Gates Foundation invests a lot in these researches, or I guess around gene editing and other kinds of technologies. Yet initiatives like the Global Observatory pushed for by Sheila Jasanoff, Ben Hurlbut, and others fail to attract enough funding to properly exist. What is the market failure here? And I'll just mention the global observatory idea is a kind of convening, as far as I understand it, a kind of convening of commentators and collection of policies around gene editing for kind of more to seed more global debate about the technology.
Thanks, David. I will admit I am not as familiar with the conversation as it relates to the Global Observatory, but the way that you're framing that in terms of needing more space for that international dialogue is absolutely crucial. And I think one of the things that is kind of incumbent upon us and kind of all stakeholders is to figure out the best way to be able to have those dialogues. And what does that look like at a regional, at a global, at a country level? And again, I'm sorry, without knowing enough about the specifics of the proposal within the observatory, but the idea to be able to foster that dialogue amongst all concerned citizens and policymakers is something that is fundamentally viable and critical. And I think that that's something that we should take into consideration.
Anyone else? Thanks, Brentley. Anyone else on this this issue of some people have philanthropic goals around fostering debate and the futures of technology, but they might not have the deep pockets to be able to foster to back it up, which I think is a valid point. But I think as we've heard, in no way, I think, are there exclusivities between these functions, and it's a matter of creating these spaces for debate around technology. Okay, how about turning towards the question of how your decisions are made, which I think people would be interested in hearing about. Let's start with Sharon. As a VC investor, you are faced with many decisions. You see lots of companies. You have to pick them. How do you do that? And do the questions about sort of social responsibility or something that's maybe beyond just the market digits, is that part of your process, or do you think it should be? And if so, like, how do you operationalize that within the constrictures of having to show investors you're making money and doing all of that?
That's a good question, David. As I mentioned before, I think the place where these social decisions need to be made is more at the government level. I think that when it comes to venture financing for companies, they should look to do no harm. I think they should not be funding things which have obvious potential for misuse or harm without the right safeguards in place. But to ask VCs and other private enterprise players to make decisions based on social agendas probably is counterproductive to the whole point of capitalism, which is, pursuing things that will result in some kind of profit. That's not to say I don't believe in double bottom lines. I actually don't think corporations should be limited in their mandate to only making money. I think that's a mistake. There should always be a social agenda. I think I began our discussion by saying that everything we invest in has a social bottom line return because we're investing in healthcare. But to then ask us to apply a filter over the investment criteria, which is the social benefit, I think that probably is a bridge too far, in the sense that if we're looking at two investments, for example, and one of them is a diagnostic tool that impacts 1 million people in the United States, can generate billions in revenues. The other is a tool that impacts 2 million people in the United States, but probably is not going to make much money because it's a very competitive area and we just don't see any margins. That might impact more people, but I don't think we should be obligated to invest in a non-profitable, money-losing enterprise just because of the number of people it impacts. And I think most Americans agree to the social bargain permits capitalism to make those decisions. And I don't think it's in society's interest for people to begin making decisions on criteria other than what we use, which is the founder's technical abilities, the size of the market, the merit of the intellectual property, the moats and barriers to entry the company has, their ability to market the product and make a margin on it, etc. Those are the criteria we use under the umbrella of healthcare and biology, which innately is delivering a social benefit. So I think maybe it sounds a little bit cute, but I think our fund is, intrinsically exempt from having to worry about that because of the nature of the investments we make. However, I have to say that many of our peers are not, in the sense that if you're investing in the next Twitter or TikTok or Facebook, and you know that this tool is shown to have deleterious effects on the youth or on elections, or somehow is lacking regulations, then I think you have a real responsibility to not just make money off of that investment, but also make sure it doesn't damage society. Again, we don't really face that conundrum. We're investing in companies that benefit society by the nature of their healthcare products. But I think not all venture capital is being invested with that vision. So that's where I think the social filter comes in. To do no harm, making sure that your investments aren't taking society in the wrong direction. Not saying that between two choices, I'm going to go for the one that optimizes the social good versus profit. Because no VC will ever do that. They'll be sued by their LPs if they do it. That's just not the way the system is set up.
Other voices on this question, which I think is not uncontroversial. I mean, I think there's an active debate going on about socially responsible investing, and the point here is bringing that in discussion with investment in emerging technology that could be controversial. So anyone else want to?
Let me just add something to clarify. If you were to draw a Venn diagram of all innovation, and then a Venn diagram of all the innovation that does social good, and then a circle for what deserves venture funding or what is profitable, I think the VC should try to invest in that intersection of all three as much as possible. But there will be an area where there's a social good, there will be a product that is necessary, which is just not profitable. And it's a mistake to leave that to the private markets or even to mandate the private markets to do it unprofitably. The right way to deal with that, I think you could ask any economist, would be to either provide incentives for investors to do it, i.e. the way the government does with orphan drug designation, things that otherwise would be less profitable, are given real financial incentives by the government to sell. I mean, credits for electrical cars is another good example where the government can nudge capitalism in the right direction. But fundamentally, if it's an area that's just not profitable, but there's a social mission, that's why we have a government. That's why we have the NIH, and that's where government funding should be directed.
Thanks, Sharon. Jeremy, when your agency is making decisions about, let's say, promoting or developing technology, how are those decisions made? And what kinds of criteria and perspectives go into those decisions?
Thank you, David. As I said, the African Union has established a high-level panel on emerging technologies. This is at the institution level. But let me make it very clear. Any member state is free to make a decision regarding a technology that it thinks definitely it can contribute to its own socioeconomic development. To be more practical, in 2007, that high-level panel, let's say, discussed around more than 10 new technologies and end up with making strong recommendation to the head of states regarding 3 of them. The first one is drones in agriculture. The second one is regarding energy, how to harness microgrids. And the third one is using gene drive technology to contribute into the malaria eradication in the continent. So from there, the head of state endorsed the report, and then made a strong recommendation to the member state to harness those 3 technologies. At the national level, this is where implementation goes on. And currently, when you consider, let's say, drones, microgrids, it's almost everywhere in the continent. The most difficult one was using gene drive to control malaria. This one definitely requires more scientific research at the national level. For now, 2 countries in West Africa, this is where really malaria is heavy. Burkina Faso and Mali have started doing research under containment facilities, under, I would say, limited environmental release, just to develop the technologies. And this is the final, I would say, product is expected probably around 2030, but it's a good start. But for Burkina Faso scientists to undertake that research, it has to go through ethical committees. It has to go through, I would say, a ministerial decision advised by the National Biosafety Authority. Then a decision is made to start the research. At some point of the research, when the scientists want to do, I would say, environmental release, then communities' consent has to be sought to make sure that you have, I would say, the social licensing for this technology. So you need to approach, you need to have a public hearing, and you need to have the consent of the community where you want to definitely do that research openly. These are the different steps. And at the end of each step, the National Biosafety Authority has to definitely certify that the research can go forward or should stop due to the risk assessment and many other, I would say, relevant tasks regarding that research. But as I said, at the continental level, usually things do move slower than at the national level. That's why when you consider genome editing today, you have countries who already moved fast by developing their own national regulations and approving scientific research to start. Kenya is one of them. And you also have countries who are currently reviewing their national legislation to make sure that genome editing is captured in the national law, and the regulation will simply help in the implementation of the research. These are the processes that are definitely used. But from the beginning, I would say in terms of decision-making process, there are instances where our institution as African Union cannot sit, but at the end of the day, he is the one who will make the final decision whether this is relevant for the continent or not, and then support the member state to implement on the ground.
Thank you, Jeremy. Brentley, could you reflect on the process of decision-making and grant-making for the Gates Foundation?
Yes, absolutely. And want to pick up on a couple of points that Jeremy was making as well. So as it relates to gene editing, first and foremost, when we look at the investments that we're making in global public goods, such as improved seeds, for instance, for crops and traits, the vast majority of the work that we do has been in conventional breeding. And yet, we fully expect and anticipate that the new technologies that are associated with gene editing and will continue to develop and provide new potential for impact. We're very excited about that. And one of the ways that we begin to think about that when we're planning and thinking about where we make some of these investments is we first look at the potential for impact. What are some of the biotic and abiotic constraints that are facing small-scale farmers? What are some of the priorities of governments in terms of the crops and some of the challenges that they are facing in terms of their ag sector? And really looking at the science in terms of the greatest potential, the potential for impact, the potential for scale, and taken together, what do we know? What's some of the promising research that's happening? Where is it coming from? Obviously, we do a lot of partnership, not only with the National Agricultural Research Services or Systems, but also the International Agricultural Research System, the CGIAR, and its various centers and institutes. And so, it's important to consider, just given how young the technology is and the fact that many countries have yet to fully figure out and make the determination as to how to regulate it. But when we look and scan across the countries that have, there's a number of countries, a fairly significant trend that is looking at different ways of categorizing gene-edited products. Some of those could be treated as transgenics or GMOs, and others may be treated as conventional products. Depending on the pathway, depending on the number of SNPs, the novelty, there's a lot of technicality that goes into it in terms of how different governments are regulating it and the criteria that they use. But certainly, one of the aspects that we are thinking about is out of the products that we're investing in now, and I'll use an example of some promising work that's being done on maize lethal necrosis and work that's being done in Kenya with the Kenyan Agricultural Research Organization and the International Maize and Wheat Center, CIMMYT, headquartered in Mexico, is to be able to use the tools of gene editing to be able to respond to the threat of maize lethal necrosis, which can be absolutely devastating. So we are very much looking at the potential for products that would be treated, in many countries as conventional products, and to be able to prioritize the limited resources, even though they are deep, for the potential for products to work their way through in various systems in ways that they could be treated as non-regulated or conventional products. And we see a lot of potential for the technology to be deployed that way, while at the same time recognizing that there are absolutely crops and traits where conventional efforts have not been able to address some of those biotic or abiotic constraints. And transgenics and transgenic approaches may be necessary, will be necessary, depending on what we're trying to solve for. But a lot of the work that we're doing currently, particularly in gene editing, is on the looking for the potential products that may not be treated as that would not have foreign DNA or treated as GMO.
Thanks, Brentley. We're fast coming to the close, and what I want to do is do a wrap-up question for all of you. We'll do it as a kind of lightning round. So if we can keep your answers short, quite short, because we have really only a few minutes. And my question would be, what's one thing the public needs to understand about funders in the gene editing space? And what's one thing that funders need to understand and respond to societal concerns? So one thing the public needs to understand about funders in gene editing, and one thing that funders need to understand and respond to with regard to society or societal concerns. Can I start? Who wants to start? Raise your hand. Or do I just call it? Okay, Jeremy, great.
Definitely, I will leave your first question to my colleagues. I'm more interested in the second one. What funders need to understand from, I would say, about the societal concerns is definitely access to the technology is key. Making sure that in the technology, I would say local scientists are involved if possible. It doesn't prevent from local scientists to also initiate that research, but partnership is key in that. Equity and I would say more democracy regarding the cost of the end product should also be something definitely to be kept in mind while developing and while investing in this technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let's turn to Sharon.
Sure. Thanks, David. Again, thanks for including me on this panel as we conclude. I think it's important for society to understand that capitalism is the right framework for society, but it's not a panacea, and it's not going to solve problems that require 15, 20, 30-year horizons, long-term planning, and resources that the private enterprise world just lacks. So society needs to understand that there's a role for government here, which is extremely important. And I believe that on the flip side, private enterprise players, including venture capitalists, need to permit the government to do that, as opposed to always clamoring for deregulation, always clamoring for, leave it to the private markets. Clearly, the private markets have failed when it comes to COVID-19. It's not, I saw an interview where Kushner and others were saying, we shouldn't do PPE. It's all private markets. Don't you believe in the private market? It doesn't work that way. This is a national defense issue. A lot of these gene technologies and others have national defense implications, resource implications, and horizons that are outside the scope of normal corporate enterprises. Therefore, I think both sides need to come to an agreement on the role of government here and permit the government to do its job with the assistance of the private enterprise world.
Thank you, Sharon. And Anne.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I think one thing that's important to keep in mind for the public is that funders have different roles in it. So while we share our data with policymakers, we fund the social science to inform that kind of technical development. We are not authorities for advocacy or policy discussions, so we're not signatory to those kinds of policy documents. On the flip side, though, we do lay the groundwork for technologies to transition. In the case of safe genes, it's laying out that groundwork for safe and predictable applications of genome editors for the health of service members and public health more broadly. And so, I guess on the funder side, one thing that is important, we strongly encourage our performers to publish their data, they present at conferences, and they engage in scientific, discourse it with their other scientific colleagues. But at the same time, we really encourage that kind of community engagement and that conversation about the ramifications of this powerful.
Thanks, Anne. And wrapping up, Brentley.
Yes, and thanks so much for the opportunity to participate in this panel and this conversation. I think, in terms of the public, I would hope that people understand the commitment that the foundation has in terms of recognizing new technology creates a lot of questions for everyone, for not only governments, but concerned citizens, the public, all stakeholders. And people will experience technology differently. They'll have different concerns. The ethical questions that can come along with new technologies absolutely need to be addressed. It's important to be able to be part of that conversation, to foster that dialogue, and that involves everybody. And I think the commitment that we have, and that's an evolving sort of, or I shouldn't say evolving. It is a commitment that we have, and that might look different a little bit on the agriculture side, as opposed to gene drive, or as opposed to some of the gene therapies that are being developed. It is critically important that for any new technology goes through the actual process through government, through the regulatory process, that there is open opportunity for concerned communities to be able to participate in the process to foster that. We absolutely believe wholeheartedly that needs to happen, and we support that. I think on the funder side, one of the things that is critically important for us, anyone who's involved in this space, is to really think about how can the right dynamics be put in place to ensure that this is not, a technology that is just for resource-rich countries. That there is an opportunity for the technology to flourish, to be able to be leveraged where it is desired in places like sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, and to be able to foster the sort of indigenous development of products and crops led by African scientists, for instance, with African partners, and to be able to create the conditions necessary for new technology to not repeat the past, where it might be coming from the West, it needs to be coming from the South, it needs to be coming from all corners, and we have the opportunity moving forward to be able to address that with the new technology such as gene editing today.
Great, Brentley. Well, that pretty much wraps up our session. I just wanted to thank the panelists. I thought it was a really rich discussion. I thought we explored a lot of dimensions of funding gene editing technologies, the kinds of political, ethical, economic kind of dimensions that are raised. Without further ado, so I guess virtual clapping for the panelists. And I would like to turn things back over to Julie to take us out. And when I do that, I'd also like the panelists to take themselves out of the room so Julie can get in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, and everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, and thank you, David, to all the panelists, Brentley and Jeremy and Sharon. I really appreciate the conversation as well and enjoyed it as our concluding panel for CRISPR-Con. In some ways, it's a full circle because from funding comes investment and then further innovation and further societal debate. So we hope that the conversations will carry on. This session, as well as all of our sessions, will be available on our CRISPR-Con YouTube channel. Today's session will be available within 24 hours, and it will be linked from our website. In just a moment, we'll be transitioning right into an ideas marketplace session with small group discussion led by some of our participants. This is a chance for all participants to turn on video and audio, join the conversation. So we hope you'll do that. To do that, you click on the sessions button on your left-hand navigation bar, and then you share your audio and video to connect. So again, it'll be a great way to continue the conversation, and we hope you'll join us there. And before we do that, though, just as the last panel in our 2020 virtual lineup, I do want to take a moment to thank all of our speakers, moderators, partners, sponsors, and ideas marketplace discussion leaders throughout this series. We had 10 panel sessions, so more than 50 wonderful speakers and numerous others who helped support those sessions. Thanks to our programmatic sponsors, Corteva and United Soybean Board, who supported us throughout the series and enabled our ability to enact our mission and bring together a lot of different voices and perspectives and insights. And thanks as well to our CRISPR-Con advisors listed at CRISPRcon.org. And finally, thanks to the audience that tuned in to listen today and to contribute throughout the whole series. Your questions and discussion in the chat function were really enriching to this entire dialogue. So although this concludes our live panels for the series, you can continue the dialogue on Twitter at #CRISPRCon2020. And again, check out past content. We'll also be following up soon to all of our listeners with recaps and additional reflections on what we heard this year at CRISPRCon 2020 across all of our 10 great discussions. So thanks again. Please carry on the conversation, and we hope to see you in our Ideas Marketplace momentarily.